Now we're going to talk to Shaun Woodward. Shaun, welcome to the show. Shaun, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I don't know if you managed to hear that. Your namesake there, Shaun, describes himself as a working class individual. He says the Labour Party should be representing him, and he doesn't believe so. In fact, he went as far as to call the current front bench morons. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I understand how angry people are feeling, but let's remember this did not start with the Labour government being elected last year. We inherited a hell of a mess, and that hell of a mess was created by the Tories over 14 years. So this is about clearing up 14 years of mismanagement of the economy, mismanagement of the National Health Service. That doesn't mean to say I don't hear how angry people are. Of course they're angry, and I've got huge sympathy with that.
But Shaun, do you really expect us to accept that when the economy was recovering in the first part of 2024, so we had GDP increasing, inflation down, interest rates starting to be cut, unemployment steady, that, like it or not, that recovery then was reversed within 3 or 4 months of the current government's tenure by way of what can only be described as a catastrophic budget, a budget that the Bank of England even are saying was so catastrophic that they've now revised the growth forecast for Britain during this year down from a paltry, pathetic 1.5% to an even more pathetic 0.75%. They've directly attributed that to Rachel Reeves's budget. So it's got nothing to do with the Conservatives.
First of all, let's remember the Bank of England did not say it was a catastrophic budget. The Bank of England has revised the growth forecast, but the connection that you've made between the two, Russell, is not one that was made by the governor of the Bank of England yesterday. So that's entirely misleading. Let's also remember that the Conservative Party brought about the inflation that led to the interest rates rising, which has crippled the economy in the process. Yes, they were beginning to come down last year in terms of inflation, but only from nearly a double-figure number that happened under the Tories. The consequence of that has been the most enormous deficit, a crisis in public spending, and there was no choice but for whoever was in government to address that or let the country go bankrupt. So blaming the Labour government for the Tory party mess is, first of all, unfair. That doesn't mean that people aren't hurting. And the problem is here that, forgive me, commentators like yourself, in forgetting the damage that was done to the economy by Liz Truss, for example, by the Tory party year after year, has to now be put right. And the idea that that is pain-free is crazy. The problem is that what you're not doing when you make the kind of commentary you're doing, Russell, is understanding just how much it hurts ordinary people to be paying for what the Tories did to the economy. And fixing it is not a pain-free process. And suggesting that somehow the Labour Party in government is responsible for the pain now is to forget what happened for 14 years of irresponsible government by the Tories. Now, that still doesn't mean that we don't need to do more. That still doesn't mean that when we see the growth forecast cut in half to 0.75%, which, by the way, is exactly the same as the rest of Europe, that still doesn't mean we don't want to do more. And that's why the Prime Minister is doing everything to try and get growth back in the economy. Let's remember that growth and productivity in the economy in the last 5 years fell dramatically, not under Labour, under the Tories. Turning that round is very, very hard.
Shaun, I'm not sure that comparing our financial economic performance to Europe is very helpful, given that France are about to enter recession, Germany are about to enter recession. So I'm not sure that's a particularly helpful comparison. How long are the Labour Party going to keep blaming...
It is helpful because
how long are the Labour Party going to keep blaming the Tories for the ills of the economy now that they've been in power, well, nearly a year?
No, first of all, forgive me, the difference between July the 4th and now is 6 months, not a year, Russell. Let's try and get some grip.
8 months.
Let's get some grip on the... Excuse me. July, August, September, October, November, December, January. We've had just over 6 months. Let's not get too carried...
Shaun, we're in February.
Yeah, the beginning of February, Russell. Look, forgive me.
The election was at the beginning of July.
Nonsense.
No. The nonsense is Labour apparatchiks like you peddling the same nonsense and rubbish where you won't listen to the public. People like Shaun in the voice note just now that are working people that have supported Labour all their lives. They can see, they're not economists, they're not mathematicians. They can see that adding a £40 billion tax burden to the economy on the basis that you cannot tax your way to growth is clearly, when you start persecuting business owners, wealth creators, entrepreneurs and so on, and pensioners and waspy women, that is not conducive with fixing the economy that, yes, the Conservatives didn't leave in a particularly good place. But for you to be lamenting, again, the same old Labour trope that we hear from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer every single week in Parliament, that it's the Tories' fault. Enough. The Labour Party are now in government. We want to hear what you're going to do about it to make things better. Clearly, Rachel Reeves, unqualified as she is making this economy worse. The data is clear for us all to see, Shaun, and the Bank of England have said exactly the same thing. So you've got to take action and start being positive. Start cutting taxes. Now, I know that's not in your ideology as a Labour Party, but that's the only way that this economy is going to grow, isn't it?
Sorry, Russell, so you would allow the deficit to grow even more, would you?
No, what I would do is cut taxes so that would increase growth, increase
so how
employment.
Do you finance,
and as a consequence of that, have you heard of the Laffer curve?
Sorry, this is basic...
No, basic economics is the Laffer curve.
Russell, this is basic economics.
Yes. Look up the Laffer curve,
I
Shaun.
absolutely respect what the gentleman... I absolutely respect what the gentleman just said to us. And I think if you listen to what he said, and I listen to what he said, your prescription, and let's take your prescription straight head on. How do you finance tax cuts? That leaves you with a larger gap in public service spending to finance. How do you finance that, Russell?
Shaun, can I answer you?
Either do it
you're
as
asking
we
me,
have done.
You're asking me a question. Yeah. I'm going to answer it. And with respect, sir, it really worries me that you think that increasing taxes increases tax take. There is a thing called the Laffer curve, which every person that does GCSE or A-level economics is taught about as one of the first things in that economics course, which is if you cut taxes, you increase the tax take because it incentivises people, because you don't get one millionaire every 45 minutes leaving Britain and taking their money and their tax with them. Have you heard of the Laffer curve, Shaun?
Of course I have, and I don't think we get anywhere by insulting each other, by asking what each of us has heard of. What we're trying to do here is genuinely answer the question which Shaun posed earlier on, which is how you help that person and how you help everybody else in that position. Dismissing the idea that Britain has got the most enormous deficit and gap between tax take and public spending is something you have to address. The idea that you address that gap by simply cutting the tax gate. On that basis, Russell, why didn't the Tories manage, when they cut taxes, to eliminate the deficit altogether? And quoting economic cycle curves as the answer is not actually going to deal with it, because it didn't do it under the Tories. And what we're trying to do is something different. How do you address the problems in the National Health Service when you've got 8 million people, which we inherited, waiting to see doctors and have treatment? You just say, look, I'm afraid your answer to that is cut taxes. That's going to help the health service. Russell, do you really believe that you help people like Shaun by literally tearing the National Health Service to pieces? Is that really your answer to the problem?
Where do you get tearing the health service to pieces from? Sorry, who's suggesting that?
Well, if you don't increase the amount of money that goes to the health service, how do you deal with cutting waiting times?
Wow. So
and if you don't actually increase taxes in order to fund that.
So, Shaun, you think that the health service, given that it now has more money than it's ever had, so £200 billion is the NHS budget, there's more money in that NHS per person than there's ever been, and that we've also heard from the Bank of England, and this brings us very, very nicely to the other point that Andrew Bailey made yesterday, that is our public sector is bloated. We have 500,000 more public sector employees, including in the NHS, yet the public sector, those employees on average are 8% less productive. So your logic, which is let's just raise taxes and chuck a load of money at the public sector, clearly is not the answer.
No, it's not.
Because that's already been done. And when you talk about the Conservatives cutting taxes, Shaun, hang on. Let me just finish my point. When you talk about the Conservative Party over the last 4 or 5 years cutting taxes, they did not do that. They increased national insurance. They increased corporation tax. The last government, I mean, were more closely aligned with you as a Labour Party member than me as a Conservative. They were not proper Conservatives at all. So we can't use the Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak government as a barometer in this conversation at all, because they weren't proper Conservatives, as you well know.
Russell, you've just quoted, let's deal with your first of your points, Andrew Bailey, and what you described rightly as the bloated public sector. Let's now actually take what Andrew Bailey said in context, not out of context, which you've done. Andrew Bailey was quoting what happened to the public sector during COVID and following COVID. The Labour Party was not in government when the public sector grew in the way that it did and became increasingly underproductive as it did. Question to you, Russell. Of that percentage, that fall of 10% in productivity in the public sector, what percentage of that took place under the Tories? The answer is nearly all of it.
Yeah, I think,
that's
Shaun,
what we've got to reverse.
What I was rebutting was your belief that just sticking more money into the public sector is the solution. It clearly isn't, because that was done under the last government and the government before that, and the public sector in efficiency terms and outcomes has got worse. Just stay there a second, Shaun, if you don't mind. We've got a voice note from Tristan that wants to comment on the conversation that you and I are having right now.
The fact is, this is to do with Labour. Labour have brought in ridiculous policies with energy, with net zero. That's just one example. Second example is they've done a disastrous budget where they just stifled growth. They stopped growth in its tracks with the insanity of putting up national insurance for businesses. And the other thing is they just keep giving money away. Like the Chagos Islands is just a prime example, 18 billion, the money they gave to the public sector. I mean, they have to take accountability for the decisions that they've made in a very short space of time.
Shaun, how do you respond to Tristan?
Well, I'm listening to what Tristram says. And first of all, I think, of course, we have to take responsibility for the decisions that are made. Of course, we have to take responsibility for the last 6 or 7 months, or even 8 months on your calculation, Russell. But what most matters here is that we take the right decisions for the long term to turn this around. Now, you and I may differ. You're a Conservative, I am not. But what I believe it is right to do, for example, on net zero, is to do something about what is happening to our climate. And if we don't recognize the need to get net zero there, if we say it doesn't matter, then what is that we're leaving for our children and our grandchildren? And is that really responsible for you to say net zero doesn't matter? I think it does matter. I think the commitment to the long term, I think the commitment, for example, to weaning Britain off fossil fuels, to building the nuclear power stations, the alternative energy solutions for the long term, is the right thing to do. Now, you may disagree with the particular individual issues that Ed Miliband may talk about as the energy secretary. But if we don't deal with building nuclear power and alternatives to fossil fuels, then because of the decisions that have been made over previous decades, we will be stuck with a reliance on our energy supplies from outside of the UK. So I think it's right that we do something about rebuilding our energy sources in the UK. The problem we're dealing with now is the failure of all previous governments, but including that of the Tories for the last 14 years, to prepare for this. But that does mean enormous pain for people. And of course, it's felt by those who have the least. And that's why I think people like Tristram and Shaun this morning, I'm not going to disagree with them. I think we in government have got to listen to what they're saying. We've got to understand how they're feeling. We've got to understand what it means for a chancellor to make these incredibly painful changes to the economy. And that isn't about saying that we don't care. And I think it would be a real mistake to think that anybody doesn't care. Of course you care. I care. You and I disagree about how we would do it. But what really matters here is that we all get in there and we contribute ideas to making this happen. I think that we've got to recognize that we had to find the money from somewhere. We had to balance the books. The books were not balanced. Your solution is to cut taxes, but if you cut taxes, you'd have to make even bigger cuts to public spending, which would mean even bigger cuts in things like the health service. Now, I agree with you, Russell, that simply throwing money at public services doesn't make better public services. That's why Wes Streeting is demanding enormous reform change inside the NHS at the same time as funding the junior doctors' pay increase.
And Shaun,
maybe you wouldn't have given the junior doctors the money.
No, I certainly wouldn't give them.
Going to get us better productivity in the health service by them being on strike.
I certainly wouldn't acquiesce to the unions as Keir Starmer's done by way of giving 22% to train drivers, junior doctors and so on unnecessarily, no, which of course in itself not only was unaffordable but in itself fuels inflation. What would you say, Shaun, to those that are listening to this, whether they be a pensioner in a cold lounge or whether they be a waspy woman or a business owner in hospitality, for instance, that's seen the double whammy of 1.2% increase in national insurance contributions or indeed a huge rise in the minimum wage? What would you say to those individuals when they also see that we're about to give £18 billion to Mauritius, which is the GDP of Mauritius, as we heard earlier on, to give away something that we already own and to pay them to take it, when £22 billion, which ironically is exactly the same as the so-called black hole that the OBR can't find, by the way, what would you say to those people when they see that £22 billion going to carbon capture at the behest of Ed Miliband is something that even Dale Vince says is a tin pot, ridiculous approach because that system doesn't work? And how do you reconcile Labour's policy on freezing pensioners, and some will die by Labour's own numbers, when we're giving away £18 billion to Mauritius and £22 billion on a lunatic carbon capture project? How do you think that pensioners should reconcile those things? You think they should be happy because there's a bigger picture involved, as you're saying?
Come on, Russell. Asking me if I think pensioners should be happy for freezing to death.
Ask the question.
Is it no? No, but that's an insulting question.
No, it's not. No. Hang on. If you're a 70-year-old pensioner in a cold house in Newcastle right now, and you're watching on the news that £18 billion is being given to Mauritius to take something that we own, to bribe them to take something that they have no business owning, how do you feel, do you think, as a pensioner, knowing that you can't afford to put any money in the meter and heat your home this winter? Answer the question, Shaun.
Well, of course they're not going to be happy. I'm not happy. I think it's appalling that we have the prospect of a Britain in which there is anybody, let alone a pensioner, over the age of 70 who cannot afford to turn their heating on. But let's remember, Russell, you don't like hearing this. We are in this mess because of the mess of the last government. And it's been clearing up that mess that led to some very, very difficult decisions. I have to say, if you want to compare the idea of 18 billion going to Mauritius compared with the idea of funding the winter fuel allowance, of course, if you make that straight, crude comparison, of course it doesn't stack up.
It's a real
but
comparison.
Then actually, if you look at some of the measures that were conducted by your government up until July of
mine, they're not mine.
Year,
I'm a Conservative with a small
none of
C.
those things stack up.
Shaun, they're not my government. I'm a Conservative with a small C, but I'm a proper Conservative. Shaun, look, we've got to go. This has been fun. I hope we can do this again because, yeah, what a fantastic debate.